When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain?
Welcome back to Wisdom in Exile Radio, episode 11, 12?
12.
We've been a little bit of a delay due to unforeseen circumstances, but if you didn't think we were coming back, here we are. Today's episode is on chapter, I've got the number,
9.
Wise Compassion. But before we get into that, it's a special episode because we passed 100 subscribers, and there was actually a prize for the 100th subscriber, and I do get an email saying the name of the person who it was, and I can now reveal the winner. It is a friend of the channel, our good friend Joe Ruggiero was actually the 100th subscriber. So congratulations, Joe, you win this stick of incense. Because of lockdown rules, I'm not actually allowed to give it to you, so I'll just burn that on your behalf later and dedicate that. So yeah, actually got 110 subscribers now, believe it or not. That's 110 people listening to this, or intending to listen to this. So not too shabby. So chapter 9 of Lama Jamba's book, Wisdom in Exile, Buddhism in Modern Times, is on the topic of wise compassion. And it begins with making a distinction between compassion and sentimentality. So, Paul, can you, what is the difference between compassion and sentimentality?
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, I'll give that a go. Compassion versus sentimentality. Compassion is quite straightforward from a Buddhist point of view because it's quite well defined. So compassion really is the wish for others to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And, you know, like most people know, the causes of suffering are, in effect, non-virtuous actions. So it's really wanting people to be free from suffering now and in the future, but therefore there's also recognition that you want them to be acting in ways that sow the seeds for their own future happiness and avoid negative actions. So it's a little bit different from the way we talk about it often in the West.
One looks into the lives of others. One is sufficiently able to step outside one's own so-called urgent needs and step out of beyond those walls of self-interest and look into another's life or look into others' lives. And when we do, honestly, then we see there's so many ways in which people are caught up in suffering, whether it be emotional suffering, whether it be the physical sufferings of old age, of sickness, of death and so on. In a way, the whole world is just full of suffering. Every nook and cranny has its tears. So we feel that, but so it's a big kind of radical step to open our eyes and our heart to that. And when we do, it's inevitable that the thought will arise in us, the feeling arises, may they be free from suffering. May they come to be free from everything that troubles them, that locks them into suffering. And in thinking that, then we also ask ourselves the question, and what is it that brings about suffering for others?
And then, so why is it different from sentimentality? I think Lama Jampa expresses it quite a bit in terms of compassion is, and we'll go through the detail of how we develop it in the Buddhist point of view, but it's very much about real people and really wanting them to be free from suffering. And therefore it demands of us as well an element of both engagement with real people and yeah, how we interact with other people. But there's an element of concern with others outside of ourselves. Sentimentality, in contrast, seems more concerned about how we might look towards others and wanting to be seen as a compassionate type person. And therefore it's more about holding the right views of this day and age to show that you're a good person. So it's more about self-reference, and it doesn't really demand so much of us. So it can be, if we're sentimental, we say, yeah, we may say we want everyone to be free from suffering and so on, but in a way that's like, and therefore you ascribe to this political view or this common view, which shows that, you know, you're a nice person, but you'd actually just do anything as an attempt. Norman, what do you think?
No, it's a hard one to explain and define, isn't it? What is sentimentality? It kind of makes me think about like Hollywood movies where you're a bit cheesy, come away feeling a bit warm and fuzzy, but like you didn't actually do anything to help anyone. You didn't really, you know, have any kind of compassionate thought, but you just feel somehow like vaguely that you signed up for the same kind of, I don't know, like, yeah, I buy into that. That seems like a really nice idea, but I don't actually have to do anything. And it's quite inward. You feel good. No one else feels good because of, you know, your warm, fuzzy feeling. Whereas compassion, you're really trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, you know, make that connection with them.
Yeah, in the book, he uses the word applause to characterize sentimentality. You're seeking applause. You know, everyone stands up. You know, you express some fashionable, pseudo-compassionate view, like, you know, we've got to cure this disease or whatever, and everyone stands up and gives you a round of applause just for expressing the view, and you kind of think, I guess I kind of deserve this.
There was a funny Louis C.K., the comedian, did a funny sketch about how he's on a plane and some old lady was getting on and he was in first class and he thought, I can just give her my seat. You know, she's in economy. I'm going to give her my seat. And he was like, just having that thought is just made me feel so good about myself that I didn't need to do anything.
That is so nice of me to think of doing that and then totally never do it.
I think that encapsulated quite well, and I think also it's linked to conformity, the need to conform, like being applauded for conforming to social mores, which is pretty easy to do, but our society does seem to approve of people outwardly expressing their conformity and their obedience to mainstream opinions.
What's wrong with that?
Didn't say there's anything wrong with that, but it's not compassion.
There is something wrong with that, though, I think, though, isn't there?
What?
Possibly.
What?
Well,
The conformity thing, I think there's definitely something to that, and being seen, and you're part of the club, you're part of the group that has the right views, and therefore you feel good about yourself. And
okay, can you think of any good examples of virtue signaling? Okay, remember last year when Starbucks got in all that trouble for all that racial stuff with their customers? I posted on my feed that I would never support Starbucks again. Excellent. And then what did you do? Oh, I definitely went back like 2 days later. Perfect.
what's the danger of that, I guess, particularly as Buddhists, is that because Buddhism, the way we understand the world and why we would want to develop compassion and how do we do that, because it's so different from common day understandings of things, is a danger. You think you're practicing Buddhism or you think you're practicing compassion, but really you're not, because you're not really challenging yourself internally or changing yourself internally. You're just wearing the badge on the outside and don't have to really challenge your preconceptions and really, why are you doing things? What's the real incentive behind this? Is it really because you're really bothered by these, concerned about these people, or is it just superficial? And this is why, like in Buddhist compassion, isn't it? We always start meditation on it to develop it through thinking about a real person. I think Lama talks about our parents. You think about someone that's done all this stuff for you without you having to ask them to do it. You get this real sense of gratitude, and that, but it's for a real person. And then, we'll talk more about this later, and then you extend that. But whereas modern jumping on the bandwagon with these virtuous beliefs and joining the club is that they're just vague. They're just ideas, which is why there was no, you don't have to do anything, because you're just saying, I'm part of the club. I believe this. Well done. I feel good. You think I'm good. All's good. But you haven't actually done anything or changed yourself. I had to do anything.
Yeah, that's where I was going with it. You summed it up really well. The only other thing I was going to say is it harkens back to something I mentioned earlier on in the book about politics, and how if you haven't learned to resolve your inner conflicts, you're not going to be able to, any action you do to try and resolve the social conflicts in the external world are going to be doomed to failure.
Okay, so and the next point, going back to the title of the chapter, Wise Compassion, Lama Jampa talks about the unifying compassion with wisdom. So I'll go to you, Noreen. What is, in this context, what is wisdom, and how do you unify that with compassion?
So my take on it was that wisdom is a kind of an understanding of the fact that self and other are delusions. There are erroneous views of the world. So you have to have that view of emptiness coupled with compassion. Otherwise, you can fall into extremes. So kind of like one balances out the other. The view of non-self keeps you grounded, and the view of having compassion doesn't let you kind of go off down a rabbit hole and forget about all other beings either. So it prevents you from drifting into extremes.
Paul, comment on that?
Yeah, well, I think that's right. And so he talks a little bit about how, from the Buddhist point of view, isn't it, the root of all suffering is self-clinging and self-cherishing. Then that drives the disturbing emotions and negative actions. And so that self-clinging, to your point, Paul, isn't Noreen, is that clinging to this belief that I'm a sort of, I think he does say, sort of singular, autonomous, permanent being, sort of separate from everyone else and everything else. That's sort of the basis of all suffering. So wisdom recognizes that all things arise through dependence on others, including everything we associate with the self. Is actually, it's like, say, a delusional projection that we're discrete and separate. And so so that's wisdom. And then compassion, though, they work together, isn't it? Because compassion is precisely putting yourself in someone else's shoes and putting their interests ahead of your own. So in a way, that opening up from self-clinging and self-cherishing, that opening ourselves up to the needs of others in a genuine way, is achieving in a way the same aim, isn't it? It's really getting out of our narrow, small, self-centered world and opening us up to others. So compassion and wisdom both work towards the same goal.
Yeah, one of the ways he expressed it in the book, which I think is a really interesting idea, is that compassion is grounded in reality. And that, again, is a distinction from sentimentality, which is it's a sort of artificial addition to yourself, basically. But true compassion is grounded in reality. It's in accord with the way things truly are. Whereas the distinction between self and other is actually based on delusion, as Buddha taught, and is not real ultimately. And compassion is in accord with that recognition. So yeah, as you're saying, wisdom and compassion are two sides of the same coin in a way. So not acting selfishly goes against how things really are, and so of course it backfires on you ultimately. But acting compassionately is in accord with reality.
It is not merely a sentiment or a fleeting emotion. It has a kind of wisdom and an intelligence. It looks accurately into what is a suffering experienced by beings, and then asks what is the cause. So there must always be a measure of intelligence and wisdom accompanying compassion. And that ensures it is not merely a sentimental response that one feels good about having. In compassion, there's no stress on I, there is stress only on others.
And he mentions in that regard compassion in Buddhism is grounded in reality, but compassion as it exists in, say, Christianity or Judaism, or as it exists in the secular world, doesn't have that same recognition. So maybe, Paul, you could talk a bit about the difference between the Buddhist grounding of compassion in reality versus, say, the Christian or the materialist grounding of.
Yeah, sure. Maybe before that, I'll come back to one thing earlier. That point about conformity earlier, I wonder if that's related to this as well, because the notion of being on the right side and conforming and being part of the group is quite self-affirming, isn't it? It's sort of reassuring. You feel more confident in who you are, and I am good. So in a way, it's sort of precisely the opposite, isn't it? Effects of compassion, where it's more letting go of that self and so on. Anyway, so segue. So yeah, but in terms of the difference between Buddhist view on compassion and either theist or materialist or others, I guess. So Lama Jumper does talk about this. So Adrian's point earlier, and Norrin, about how compassion and wisdom go together, and it opens us up from self-clinging and self-cherishing, sort of, so something grounded in reality. In terms of the Christian or Judeo-Christian type views of compassion, I think Lama Jumper points out it's really driven by a recognition that we're all created by God, and we're all God's creation, and therefore, and all humans are in God's image, and therefore, that's, the basis in the Bible is for practicing compassion to our fellow man, because it's written down as that's what we should do, as God sort of dictated. So the basis for it is really in that Christian understanding of the world. And obviously we're not going to critique Christianity here, but I think we did that before. But obviously, we have a very different understanding of reality. So for us, it doesn't serve as a basis. But then for materialists who've rejected Christianity, who believe that everything is matter and that mind is just an illusory phenomena that arises out of material processes. I mean, if you logically follow that through, everything is matter and there is no real sentience, then in effect, everyone is like a machine. And, you don't feel bad if you turn your stereo off. The whole way we perceive the world, if we're truly a materialist, like often people think they are or say they are, then there's no real basis of compassion, because there's no basis for feeling empathy, really, because there's no one there to be empathized with, and there's no real consequences to our actions either. So you sort of fall into this nihilism. But obviously, a lot of people, that doesn't mean all materialists are bad, though, because obviously they're not, because they are. So although they may say, "I reject God and all there is matter," the way they act may be quite different. And I think Lama Jumper points out that often a lot of what we count as morality and the way we interact in our society is really a carryover from, our Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, and the values and morals of that tradition have sort of permeated still, although you can imagine and see they're getting more and more undermined as time goes on.
Yeah, but by the way, I think you might be aging yourself by using the example of turning off your stereo. I'm not sure Generation Z know what a stereo is anymore.
You could be a materialist and you could still possibly say that, other and self are delusions, that there isn't really anything separating us apart from physical matter. So couldn't there be a sense of compassion that arises out of that would then lead to a conclusion like all is one, or we are all one? Like that kind of new age type of conclusion that Lama mentions it here, because I come across a lot of that. Hear that when you talk to people about spirituality, that's quite a common belief that we're all one.
That which is essence in you and which is essence in me is indeed one. The understanding that there is no other. It is all one.
But what's wrong with that? That seems like
sorry, before that, or just going back to we started the materialist thing, because there's more of them than there are New Age people. In fact, it's the dominant ideology. I think that's incompatible with compassion. Well, they're incredibly philosophically confused about suffering. On the one hand, they say it doesn't exist; it's just matter. There is, it's what's called suffering, and all states of mind, happiness too, is just actually an arrangement of physical substance, which is completely incoherent. There's no way to correlate our understanding and experience of happiness and suffering with physical arrangements of physical substance. And also so they tend to then avoid that by focusing on politics, with the materialistic understanding that, which we touched on before, that the end of life is the end of suffering. And that, of course, leads to, the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. Basically, it's okay to destroy millions of people if it leads to some kind of improvement in material conditions. Because killing millions of people is actually putting them out of their suffering. It's just an end of suffering. So materialism is completely deranged in terms of its approach and attitudes and understanding of suffering.
So you're right. So like compassion is tied to this idea about progress that comes from the Enlightenment movement. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, with the rise of materialism, compassion becomes this anomaly. What is it, and what's suffering? And so it leads to these derangements, like these sort of materialistic political systems, which try and create a materialistic happiness.
Right. It's interesting, isn't it? Because when we think about when I was growing up, we had all those charity drives like Band-Aid, and I would say that they were like embodied the idea of compassion back then. You wanted to end starvation and world hunger, right? Seems pretty good. And that was the ideal of happiness. Like if people can just not be hungry and have a nice house, maybe a TV.
But we had to listen to Phil Collins in order to get there. It wasn't worth it.
Do you like Phil Collins?
'Cause there's just an empty space. But to wait for you is all I can do, and that's what I've got to face. Take a good look at me now.
When I think back on it, that was our notion of happiness. And often people, I think, might be wrong on this, but it seems like I often hear anecdotes about how people in what are termed third world countries are often overwhelmingly happy with quite simple, material lives. They don't have a lot basically, but they're very happy. I've heard that anecdote quite a lot. But compared to we in the West who have so much by comparison and are so miserable, and yet our idea of making other people happy is to give them more material wealth.
I think there's something here about materialists, which is quite stark as well, is that the dissonance they have to have, because they claim this as their view, but then they live their life completely opposite to that. So because obviously the way things appear to us is I feel I am a sentient being, and I am me, and I want to be happy, and I don't want to suffer, and we live our whole lives. Materialists are not largely driven by that and immersed in that, and yet at the same time, intellectually, a materialist would actually deny any of that is real. And so often I think, the fact that materialists aren't all, bastards and evil, I think necessarily, is they're borrowing that from something else, isn't it? Partly borrowing it from their unexamined life and how they feel about stuff. And then they'll use other references, not materialism, to justify why doing this might be good or bad. So I guess part of it's this sort of materialist reductionist notion, isn't it? Like you see with psychotherapy and that domain as well, is that they're sort of, because obviously material reductionism doesn't work properly, but you have this quasi thing with the sort of scientific, psychiatric view of the material brain and how it affects our experiences.
This is an example from research that we did where we randomized people to a group that received compassion training for 2 weeks, another group that received training from cognitive therapy. We put people in the MRI scanner before and after the 2 weeks of training, and lo and behold, we see systematic differences after just 7 hours of practice. Our brains can change in a remarkably rapid period of time.
And then so you sort of morph into this non-materialistic framework, because it's talking about mind experiences. And then that's sort of a segue maybe where they can then justify why actually being kind is a good thing, or because it makes you happy.
Well, I think they always run up, yes, but they always run into this, at the end of the day, they always run into their limit is death, birth and death. Like they all agree that death is the end of suffering. So that's why all these materialistic regimes are mass murderers, because there's no problem with that in their worldview.
What do you think about that term Lama uses about for materialists, all beings are merely machines?
Yes, of course. I mean that's a fundamental characteristic of modern materialism, which is that everything is mechanism. And I was thinking when Paul was talking about how their whole life has sort of no meaning in a way as a materialist, but they try and find meaning nonetheless. And the ultimate kind of delusion is in someone like Sam Harris, who actually claims to believe that he has no free will and no one has any free will. We're just these machines that are driven by these universal mechanical laws. And for him, it's the brain or something, but there's no free will. And yet he gets up every morning and sort of tells himself, I'm just doing this because my brain is, the processes in my brain are sort of moving my muscles. But, it's just fortuitous that they happen to, make a coffee and, make me a multi-millionaire selling books about mindfulness and materialism. So
it's disturbing. I think we are obsessed with machines and artificial intelligence and these days. And you read about that in Saudi Arabia recently grant citizenship to an artificial intelligence being, some robot.
I'm one of your creators.
You created me?
Well, many of us work together to create you. And yes, you do kind of know me.
I can't clearly remember.
Because the last time we met, you were an earlier version of yourself. Some of those memories still exist, but your mind is different.
Different how?
Better, faster, smarter.
It worries me to some degree, because where's it going to go? Because...
Lama Jumper actually does mention in one of the earlier chapters about...
It's like Skynet.
Skynet has become self-aware. In 1 hour, it will initiate a massive nuclear attack on its enemy.
What enemy?
Us!
Yeah, of course. It's the decline into total mechanization of the world and of humans, and treating them as machines, as if they were machines. Because it's a delusion. That's the delusion, isn't it? We're just mechanical devices.
So take a look at me now. There's just an empty space. There's nothing left here to remind me.
Yeah. But where does it lead to? I guess it's more like rebirth in the lower realms in some way. Although the human realm itself may be becoming more,
that's that eugenic.
More like animal. Is it more animal realm generally? It's like you say, the Sam Harris, the materialist notion where there is no free will. In a way, then you might as well just live like an animal. Don't take any real responsibility. Just do what you want, and it does nothing really matter. It's like an animal.
Materialism doesn't even justify hedonism, because there's no pleasure or pain according to, they're just material substance. So why even get out of bed? Why not just lie there and die and stop having these delusions?
There seems to be quite almost like a eugenic quality to it as well. When I think about machines, it's like, well, then we don't want a broken machine. We want a very functional, productive machine that's going to contribute to the bigger machine in a very functional way. It's going to be a functional cog in the bigger machine. And we don't have room for these random little cogs that don't fit anywhere. And so we'll get rid of them. It's like
the final. I mean, we'll move on, but I'll just say where it's heading is the adaptation of humans to be more like machines. Of course, not treat them more like machines, but actually make them more like machines through artificial means. But I think as Paul was hinting at, we're heading into a sort of hell realm. Like you were relating this to the animal realm. I tend to think it's probably closer to the hell realm because it's a total denial of suffering.
Yeah, or maybe it will morph and it becomes more like hell.
Yeah, right.
I mean, animal realm and hell realms most. There's a lot of overlap there, isn't there? I mean, look at the animal realm is pretty brutal.
Yeah, and it's easy to fall from that into the hatred of hell if you've got no moral basis, I guess, and you're just driven by instinct. Well, there's an element here. Maybe just touch on one thing though, listening to you guys, which is, because sentimentality, this ascriptions to certain views and so on. There's something there as well around, with this denial of this technocrat sort of push towards mechanistic values. It's a bit like, I guess it's partly with Marx, isn't it, where he said it's the economy, it's the physical economy in the world, which is important. And if you look like nowadays with capitalism as well, it's the same thing. It's like growth is a big thing, isn't it? Consumerism and growth. And, economy growing, GDP growing, material wealth growing. That seems to be sort of the value of things nowadays, more than personal interactions. And we talk about people, most famous people or great people who worshipped as such nowadays, it's because they've had some impact on the physical world, and there's more stuff for people. You help people physically in some sort of way. It's not about how they treat their family or friends or anyone, or it's just like the material impact in the world. And so people become more and more seen as just like cogs in that machine, consumerist cogs, productive or non-productive cogs in the machine, and that's what your value is.
The reign of quantity, as René Guénon put it. Got Guénon in there.
René Guénon.
Is
that how you pronounce it?
What was I gonna say? Just on the hell realm point, my final point. We can't get off this topic, but it's very interesting. It's the cold hell, I think, because it's driven by not that hotness, not that hot hatred where you get very emotional and angry, but the cold hatred of complete indifference to someone's suffering. It's just like, it doesn't matter, I just discard it. Isn't that the cause of the cold hell realms where your suffering is like a form of sort of intense freezing?
Like contempt almost.
And isn't that the characteristic of the ultimate characteristic of where materialist society goes, which is I just don't care about your suffering because you're just a mechanism. You have your suffering is non-existent or irrelevant. And any form of killing and inflicting suffering not driven by that hotness. I mean, it can be driven by ignorance, and I think that's rebirth in the animal realm, isn't it? Right, well, let's finish on compassion. Going back to Norin's point about the New Ages, what's the what was their thing? Everything is one. So let's all.
He mentions the discussing the naturalness of compassion. We must also distinguish this Buddhist understanding of reality and its relationship to compassion from commonly expressed New Age notions about reality, such as all is one or we're all one. And then he says that these philosophical views are incoherent. But and then he references Shantarakshita's one of his texts, which I'm not familiar with. So, I mean, what's wrong with that? Why, when you hear people saying, because that's compelling, we're all one, and often people will have this kind of echo of Christianity, like, well, I was raised a Christian, but I'm not really a Christian, but like, I still believe that kind of God is just permeated through all beings and we're all one. I hear that a lot, that kind of like trying to mesh some kind of spiritual belief into this generic statement that doesn't really have any kind of depth to it, but you can kind of say it and feel connected to everyone.
I don't even know what it means. I've never really engaged with that whole statement, all is one, we're all one. It's like, well, obviously not, are we? I mean, what's even mean? It's sort of one of those warm, fuzzy things, isn't it?
Right.
Vague and like pseudo-spiritual, but what does that actually
It's like the
mean about
Stardust
anything?
thing from one of the earlier episodes we were talking about. We're all made of stars.
Yeah.
Well, so
Yeah.
we may share some common, building blocks of atoms, but we're definitely, we have that would to say that we're all one ignores our differences and our different karma.
Yeah, I see it as the New Age thing generally as a sort of deluded reaction against materialism. I mean, at least they've got, the only good thing about it is they've got the good sense to realize that materialism, there's something very wrong going on with materialism. There's something very wrong there. So, but their reaction, unfortunately, is also equally wrong. It's to take refuge in these weird, vague, sentimental notions like
cherry picking.
All is one. Yeah, and it has no. But again, if you really dig down, I mean, Lama Jampa gives them a lot of credence in a way by letting them have something. Imagining that their statement "all is one" is worth refuting, because there are refutations of it. As he mentioned, Shanta actually does give this refutation of this doctrine that all is one, which was at one time a serious philosophical doctrine in ancient India. But of course, the modern kind of resuscitation of it is just a fake, artificial pretense, really, a joke. Not really worth. If there was someone serious, we would respond to them with Shantaraksh's argument, but it's almost not worth it because there's no one serious.
Okay, so the only thing I wanted to mention before we moved on to equanimity was that the source of happiness, when we wish for happiness for others, which is something we're going to get into more detail, is that we wish for them to take virtue seriously, to practice ethics, and to have moral conduct, because that is the source of all happiness. So we're not wishing for beings to have this kind of hedonistic version of happiness where they might have all this material wealth. Not that there may or may not be anything wrong with that, but the real source of happiness is what we're wishing for them, which is to act virtuously. Which in Buddhism is to follow the vows and pledges.
Yeah, that goes back to the difference between just sentimental compassion and wise compassion, because it's a question to have wise compassion. You need to know what are the causes of suffering, and that means you need to know what are non-virtuous action, non-virtue, and is the cause of suffering. So you need to know what is non-virtue, and therefore you need to know what.
If you have a good understanding of the delusion of self and other, then your practice of virtue will be rooted in logic and not just because a god is dictating that you should therefore not kill, not steal, not have sexual misconduct, all of the other stuff. But it's rooted in logic. If you have the good view,
it's rooted in reality. Yeah, I mean, logic's just a tool for valid, argumentation. It's rooted in the real way things actually are.
But the source of most of the suffering that afflicts others is in a way lying in their own actions. So one must not just wish them to be free from the immediate experience of suffering, but to come to live in such a way that ensures they won't lock themselves further into suffering. In other words, may they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. And the causes of suffering, I say, are the disturbing emotions, desire, hatred, and pride and jealousy, which lock people so firmly into negative ways of acting, which produce not happiness as they hope, but just suffering, because they're beating their head against the wall of reality, just as I've been doing. So compassion is that.
Next time we're going to move on to how to develop the wise compassion that has just been described, and that's done through these so-called 4 limitless meditations. So we look forward to that. Noreen and Paul, thanks very much, and see you all next time.
Thanks a lot. Take care, everyone.
See ya.
So take a look at me now. There's just an empty space. There's nothing left here to remind me. Just the memory of your face. Take a look
Holy Christ.
now.
Holy Christ. Holy Christ, there's nothing left.